Hello everyone. My name is Claudia Jovanovic. I'm here today with Steven Erikson for one special interview, which will be focusing mainly on book content. That will be, um, damn. Okay, so Steve,
Yeah, full of spoilers, I would think.
yeah, well, spoilers will cover everything that has been written so far, both your books and Cam's books.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
this is for grown-up Malazan fans. So, so I will begin with my first question. It's about the prologue, and why did you choose that particular scene to begin the series?
Oh, wow. The first version of the book actually starts at the Siege of Pale. My first draft had nothing preceding that. And I realized I needed to set a much larger framework in place. And so I moved back in time. And I think I was looking for an opening that would take us, begin the story in the heart of the Malazan Empire, even though I knew I would be leaving that empire, well, fairly quickly. And um, and then I wanted to set in place a long-term plan by Shadow Throne and Dancer, and so if I started everything just at the Siege of Pale, there was a lot of backstory that was relevant to the actual storyline of the series that I would have had to explore in some other fashion. And so instead, I took us back to a period where everything was sort of beginning. So it's almost the prelude to the rest of the novels. And then I knew that once I got that laid down, with the characters, the few characters I was going to use at the opening, I would come back to it at the end of the 10th book and swing everything around again. And so that was kind of the idea with the prologue. I don't know if that's an answer to your question or not, but
It is.
yeah.
Actually, it's a scene packed with information. The whole book is thick with information more than the others.
Mm.
And before I make my second question, there was an essay you once wrote where you explained how you write and you made a metaphor of certain bells that you ring from time to time.
Hmm.
Please explain that again for people who didn't read the essay.
Sure. Um, and I talk about this a lot in with beginning writers in workshops. It can feel very daunting to think in terms of writing a whole novel. And it becomes even more daunting if you're thinking in terms of writing 10 novels that are all part of the same sequence. And what I found was if I approach this as if I was writing a connected series of short stories, then it becomes much easier. So that my target, um, for every time I sit down to write, my target is basically the one paragraph and then the section and then the chapter and that kind of thing, working my way upwards. But each time I sit down to write, it's to handle a single scene. And so, what I learned with short story writing was you do a lot of sort of preparations with short stories um, where you're not looking for sort of plot-based climax elements to a story, at least not in modern sort of quote literary unquote short story writing. Um, what you're looking for is very subtle changes to the narrative, um, which then become the whole point of the short story. Um, so in that sense, I write in an elliptical fashion. So my opening scene will have some kind of detail in there that I'll take note of, um, that actually speaks to that section in terms of theme, symbol, all the subtextual stuff, which then having taken note of, I will come back to it, and by the end of the section, I'll wrap it up by returning to that image or that sentence or that phrase, and hopefully, because of what I've written in between, the context is slightly and subtly changed. So even though I'm ringing the bell the second time to finish the section, or a third time, the tone is different, slightly, a slight change. And then that's one section complete. And so it feels like I've done my job for, for that day or those 2 days or however long it takes to write it. And it's manageable. And then I do it again, and then I do it again and again and again, day in, day out, finish a chapter, and then continue onwards from there. And that way, I'm not intimidated by the idea of a novel being 250,000 words or 400,000 words. None of that intimidates me at all, because all I'm working on and all I'm thinking about specifically is, when I'm writing, is the section that I'm working on. And nothing else is actually sort of impinging upon my sensibilities. So I'm not sort of getting intimidated by the sense that, I'm only on page 15 and I'm looking at writing a 1,000-page novel. So that's sort of how I learned to engage in a series that was going to be 10 books long. So I'm giving you long answers. So if you have lots of questions, this is going to take a while. So
That's okay.
okay.
So going back to these bells,
Mm-hmm.
the most amazing one of them is Mock's Vein, because it's the first of the series and the last in the Triple God.
Yeah.
And it gets run throughout, mostly in the Bone Hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the meaning of Gardens of the Moon, which probably it also refers to whatever gardens we find in Moonspawn. But there's Absalar right after she's being released by Cotillion, and she talks to Crocus about some legend that her people have about some god up on the moon, and he will come and rescue them all, and everybody will be living ever after. But then the same bell is rang again in the Bone Hunters, where she talks to the rope again, and there's a certain sadness as opposed to the first time she talks to Trocus about it, and she's all hopeful, which is, kind of nice. But one that I'm not sure if it's just a bell or actually more of a leitmotif or a theme of the series is the advice that Whiskey Jack gives to Paran in the prologue to live a life beneath the notice of the gods. That too returns with Rake after he kills the hounds and tells him, whatever you did to gain the notice of the gods, you've done it wrong. And then the third time in the end with Cotillion telling him that, you clearly didn't do it right, since you did attract the notice of the gods. But this is not just a bell, it's also a leitmotif.
Say again?
I'm saying this isn't just one of the bells that you've been ringing through
Yes.
the story, it's also one of the main themes of the series.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you combine them together?
Well, I think your camera's frozen up, by the way, but I think that's a hard one. I mean, I'll go back to the Gardens of the Moon one. There's a commentary element to that story, and Sari's sort of take on it, or Absalar's take on it. And it's a comment, and it's why it's the title of the first series. Nobody's ever asked me this. This is curious. But the title is related to my sensibilities. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Related to my sensibilities of the fantasy genre as being a kind of a magical place in which someone wishing to escape the vicissitudes of the daily grind of their lives, um, can go to. And so for for a lot of my growing up, my reading fantasy, and especially I was reading things like Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's pure escapist literature. It's romantic literature. And I grew up very poor, and there was a lot of stress in the household. So it was my way out, if you will. And I wanted to sort of pay homage to that, but at the same time, I knew I was going to be deconstructing those tropes and those notions of fantasy as escapist literature. And I was actually going to go in the opposite direction with this series. So yeah, when she talks about when Absalard talks about the Gardens of the Moon, and she's talking about a kind of the uh, sort of the folk tale or legends or children's stories of a better place and a better world, and that's why I think when she finally gets back to it, when that conversation resumes in the Bone Hunters, um, she's older, wiser, and she has lost some of that innocence that she had in Gardens of the Moon. And I think in many respects, if the reader has gotten to that point of reading the Bone Hunters, they've also lost that notion of fantasy exclusively as escapist literature, because I drag so much of the suffering of the real world into the series. And so there is, so that element of sadness is always going to be there. But for the second side of things, the second part of your question, it's just that there are themes that were underlying the entire series, and um, every now and then I have to revisit them, and knowing that the readers have come along with me to that point, when you revisit them, it's not the same as when it was first broached or brought up. And so there has been an evolution both in the readership and in the characters. And I wanted to reflect that as often, well, not very often, but when it was important to do so, I would reflect it, that we were both on this journey, and the things that were important to us in the beginning are maybe not as important to us, halfway through and by the end. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Also, somewhat related to that, obviously you explore a lot of concepts and ideas. Some reflect your own views, some are just exploratory. And this brings me to Circle Breaker, the eel's spy. And there's something in his internal monologue. He talks to himself and he thinks, never reached too far, a life lesson he had learned on the burning deck of a Corsair ship. That sounds to me like a warning that resonates with live a life beneath the notice of the gods. Yet it seems to be in opposition with what I believe might be your own point of view. There's a quote from the preface of Gardens of the Moon where you say that there is no point in beginning something without ambition, that there you push, defy convention, go for the throat. This seems to be in direct opposition to the advice that the characters get.
Yeah, and this is also the first time anybody has linked the internal monologue narration of Circle Breaker directly to me as a writer and as an author. But for me, there was a very, very direct connection. I don't have a copy of Gardens of the Moon floating around it here, but I think Circle Breaker has the last line of the book.
Yes.
Yeah, and that line is no longer anonymous to the world. And so the journey he took was the same journey I was taking as the person writing my first fantasy novel. That I had this hope that with the publication of the novel, I would no longer be anonymous to the world. And so it was a bit sort of bullshit of me to do so, but I threw it in there because I always knew that there was a strong meta element to Gardens of the Moon, and would be for the entire series. So Circle Breaker was quite often my stand-in in the novel. But of course, just as in the writing of that novel, I was experiencing doubts and thoughts regarding the extent of my ambition and what I was taking on here. And a lot of um, the pressure I would be getting, real or imagined, well, both, I guess, in terms of this is way too big. Try for something a bit more manageable and all the rest. Um, I was still a young writer, so I would take it on board and try to tail things back, at least initially in my mind. And then I realized I have to fight that. I wanted to do something much more um, all-encompassing in terms of my thoughts on the fantasy genre, especially epic fantasy, but also my thoughts on writing itself. And um, so the writing of the series was very much an exploration of those aspects as well, which simply made use of the fantasy setting, but wasn't actually about the fantasy setting. It was about the potential of what writing can do. And I wavered. There were times when I was pretty much convinced that writing can't do anything. It really can't change anything. It has no way of uh, uh, any kind of saving of humanity in any fashion. And so, a lot of there were times when I felt that all I'm doing is just filling up pages. And so that is a side of things that a lot of readers don't understand. I think when it comes to writers, is that we are plagued with doubts as we're working on stuff. Um, and then we complete it. We have all this sense of elation, and then 3 days later we're in the dumps because we've done this, and yet is it going to make any difference? Is it going to make any changes in how people interact and live in the world? And so, yeah, Circle Breaker was very much my stand-in, both for the faith in doing what he was doing, but also in the doubts he was experiencing.
Okay. Charles Perrin, he tells Whiskey Jack that he wants to be a soldier, that the world doesn't need another wine merchant, and he thinks himself to be so smart in his dreadnought. He believes, I think, that being a soldier is the same as being a hero, and that there's some sort of glory in it.
Sure. Yeah.
This seems to be one of the narratives that you were trying to subvert, the adulation of soldiers as the absolute embodiment of heroism.
Yeah.
And how do you think it applies to real life?
Well, and this is one of the things I've talked about. Even in that last essay I wrote, I became obsessed with notions of heroism, and it did occur to me that a lot of what epic fantasy and adventure stories are about is about heroic acts, and usually it's heroic acts with a sword in hand or a knife, or you know um, saving the vulnerable people and all the rest, whether it's a damsel or whatever. But it always struck me that actually some of the greatest acts of heroism that are occurring all around us every day are not witnessed. They're not seen. Sometimes the act of getting up in the morning, for a person, can be the greatest act of heroism, because we just don't know. We don't know what they're going through. We don't know what they're experiencing on a daily basis. Um, and I wanted to explore that side of things as well. And so, even though it's a series of centered very much on military campaigns, um, I did want to sort of broaden the idea of what it is to be heroic. Um, but there was always the dilemma, which was, can an act be heroic if it is unwitnessed? Your camera's just come off again. There you go. And it's a question I couldn't answer because even when I created scenes that were ostensibly unwitnessed within the Malazan world, they were certainly witnessed by the reader. And so it left the question, sorry, we lost sound?
Oh, no, I'm okay. I'm okay.
Okay. Yeah, it left the question unanswered. And I don't have a problem with unanswered questions. I know readers sometimes do, but I have no problem with it. I think some questions can't be answered or can only be answered on an individual personal basis. So I often argued in workshops, even when I was a student, that it was presumptuous for an author to think they had the right answers, and that writing and art itself was actually a search for the right questions. And you simply ask them and then leave it at that.
Okay. Also, still in the prologue, there's one detail. Yeah, there's one
Okay.
detail that for me it was very emotional, especially the second time I went through it, because the first time it went unnoticed, and it probably goes unnoticed by everybody. When Paran notices that an abattoir must be on fire,
Mm-hmm.
Whiskey Jack's silence is actually an act of mercy
Mm-hmm.
because he knows what's burning down there and it's not pigs.
No.
So, in addition to the this aspect of how profoundly emotional it is, um, that particular scene, the killing of the witches
Mm-hmm.
of the mouse quarter, we know what a devastating effect it had later on for the island.
Mm-hmm.
Was that did you place that moment there as foreshadowing, or was it something that Cameron later explored?
Yeah, Cameron picked up on it. Cam picked up on it. And the thing is, that's what I appreciate the most about Cam is that he will pick up on things and run with them in directions I never anticipated, and build on them. And so, a lot of the writing, especially of Gardens of the Moon, was written to Cam. He was my audience of one. Um, and the fact that he could take something that seemed fairly incidental, and wasn't even going to be touched on in the rest of the series for me, and build on it, I think was very rewarding for me. And that's one of his great skills is to see things from a completely different perspective, and to choose details that I just drop in there, that he then takes and expounds on and explores. Um, so I was basically setting up a scene only to indicate something of the scene's um, belief or need for controlling every situation. And of course, the most uncontrollable aspect of the Malazan world is magic. And so, she's there trying to control it, and it's not going to work. She's using the military to enforce her will, and it's not going to work. And Whiskey Jack knows it, and Fiddler knows it. And Paran Ganos is just a child in the middle of all this, and he's sort of absorbing stuff, but he's not understanding what he's absorbing. So, he's your focal point, but there's a lot of things going on around him that, on first read, nobody's going to pick up on, and then quite often, I think on second, maybe third read, they're still not picking up on them. So, um, yeah, it's funny. I mean, there are I always thought that I was providing, enough details. Um, and I'm realizing now that, in many respects, uh, those details would have come across to the readers, um, much more directly with just, one more sentence, one more phrase would have done the trick. Um, I'm listening to three guys who are doing a very intense discussion of uh, chapter by chapter of Gardens of the Moon. And I think they've done 38 chapters or 38 podcasts now. And I've just started listening to it. And they go on in great detail about Sari and her recruitment early on in Gardens of the Moon. And they take note of when she appears in front of the recruiting sergeant, she's got red mud on her shins and feet. And all three of them are utterly convinced that that's indication that she has traveled through a war, because there is no red mud, anywhere around where she's come from or where she's gone to in terms of recruiting. And none of them, it hasn't occurred to any of them that that is actually dried blood from walking through, that scene of devastation. And that's not their failing, it's mine. If I had thrown in, one internal thought in the sergeant or the recruiting guy, along the lines of, it's the color of blood, just drop the word blood in there. That would have been the flag that every reader needed. And I didn't do it. And so I guess if I have regrets regarding Gardens of the Moon, is that there are many instances where one more phrase or line could have just made it so much easier for the readers, in terms of in terms of picking up on the subtextual and foreshadowing elements. So, oh well, it's done.
The challenge is accepted and it's fun, so. Okay, there is something to be said about the power of names. For example, the cripple god becomes Kaminsod in the last, 2 books. As far as Gardens of the Moon is concerned, we meet this nameless fisher girl. Then we meet as Sorry, and then gets renamed as Epsilar. But we never ever get her real name.
No.
Why is that?
By the time she gets her independence back, when Cotillion leaves, she is not the fisher girl anymore. I mean, her life experiences is taken her much further beyond that, and so she willfully chooses a new name. I don't have her name. I don't know what her name is, but I don't think it's actually relevant, by that point. And the name Sorry is, if anything, indicative of Cotillion's remorse at possessing her. Most people don't see it that way, but there was an element of that. So,
on the same note, why did you choose to withhold Circle Breaker's name as well? In the end, he says he's no longer anonymous to the world, but we don't get his name.
Well, that's where he's definitely standing in for the name Steven Erikson, right? So I didn't want a competing name to be there, for my own satisfaction. He had to remain unnamed, because there was that meta element to it, where, in terms of the role he was playing, and that meta element is re-explored by the time I get to Toll the Hounds, but by that point it's through Krupp, not Circle Breaker. So, but I revisited that idea with a patrol individual, a guy who just walks the streets on behalf of, I guess a constable would be the best phrase for him. And he's also, I believe, unnamed. And so he kind of echoes what Circle Breaker's role was in the first book. And in this instance, he's heading towards a massive heart attack. And then, of course, Hood steps in. And in a meta fashion, steps in for me and says, no, this one's not going to die. So that kind of stuff is going on all over the place in the books. And that's where I was sort of exploring the nature of storytelling itself. That's when I talked about, in terms of the things I wanted to approach, went beyond just epic fantasy as a genre, but to the notion of storytelling itself, and the fact that every detail chosen by the narrator is not indicative of a world. It's indicative of the thoughts of the narrator and nothing else. Um, which means there's an element of control that's always in place and sitting behind the curtain. And so I wanted to sort of shake that curtain up a bit every now and then.
So for the next question,
Mm-hmm.
Cotillion goes mostly by the rope in Gardens of the Moon, and he also seems a lot more vicious and unpredictable and cruel than the Cotillion we know. Is the use of the name, the rope versus the Cotillion, a tool you use for his gradual humanization?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, he's very much the patron god of assassins early on, um, but he's also in constant company with Shadow Throne, who is becoming increasingly less human um, the more power he accrues. So uh, Dancer sees that, and he has, I guess, an instinctive aversion to following the path that Shadow Throne is on. And so that's where he starts walking back towards his own humanity. And that kind of, I mean, sorry becomes crucial to that because his possession of her was a very cruel thing. Um, and when he's forced out of that, then he has to reconsider sort of the rule, the path he has taken. And, you know, it all leads up to his greatest act of mercy in the 10th book. And it's the one that a lot of readers still don't get, but you know, it's the only means by which the crippled god can be returned to his universe. So
Uh, Also about that, there's a memory that Whiskey Jack and the Bridge Burners have of Sorry that really disturbs them, of her torturing some soldiers in a real cruel manner. But that doesn't seem like the dancer we know. Is that a reflection of Sorry's own personality? Or
no, no, that's very much the Dancer, you know, because Dancer was always um, he did the dirty work for Shadow Throne, and that was his job. Um, Even in the role playing stuff, yeah, he was the NPC that I ran, and yeah, he would do all the messy stuff. So in a sense, it's an echo of his old role. So if he's now at that point working on behalf of that military unit, then the acquisition of intelligence is, you know, an overriding desire on his slash her mind, and she then does whatever is necessary to get that information. Yeah, she's pretty cruel to begin with. Yeah.
right before dying, Vriga, the old seer, she has a prophecy about Sorry's possession and how she will be liberated by Rake. Cotillion and Shadowfno are not aware of it. There's even this comment that it's a shame she might have had one more in her. What triggered the prophecy? Was it her impending death or the proximity of the gods? Why would she have a prophecy right there and then?
um, yeah, she foresaw her own death, but then, um, you know, with the candles and all the rest, she's been biding her time, living in a world of grief, having lost, you know, all these people to Malazan expansion and the wars um, that were part of that. Um, so yeah, I mean, she has those abilities, and basically, I set out to create that prophecy as something that I wouldn't actually revisit for a long time. You know, it took a while within the book, not the full series. Um, but again, I guess a part of me did not want her to completely disappear from the story. That she needed to have, you know, one final act of defiance of against, you know, the whole notion of empire, and so that's how she did it. But and prophecy is certainly, it's not something we did a lot um, in the Malazan world or universe, but when it did show up, It was through the deck of dragons for the most part. And so that gave me the opportunity with Fiddler to, yeah, lay out some plot elements, but bury them deep so that, you know, they're not immediately um, discernible, or you can't necessarily work things out from them. You can do it later, you know, in your second and third reads. You'll understand what, you know, that prophecy is, um, and that's always fun. It's always fun to set those up. I mean, fantasy uses prophecy a lot, just as mythology, legends, and all the rest are big on prophecy. So it's just one more element, I guess, of the fantasy trope, if you will.
Okay, my next question is actually from Andrzej Wodenik. He was asking, why did you choose to kill most of the bridge burners in the tunnels? It seems like wasting an opportunity for a lot more fun characters.
Well, sure, but I mean, aren't there enough characters already? Um, you know, bear in mind that when I got to the bridge burners, we had already gamed them, and we gamed the whole northern campaign. And but for the purposes of the 10-book series, I knew I would need, or rather, there were going to be two elements. And so the bridge burners were on their way out, and the bone hunters were on their way in. And so um, rather than taking the bridge hunters or the bridge burners from their formation all the way through to their completion, that would have been writing out the gaming that we did, and that's not where Gardens of the Moon starts. Um, but then once they were retired, I didn't want to leave behind that possibility of exploring this through a legendary army. And so we got to see the formation of a legendary army similar to the bridge burners in the bone hunters. And, you know, there's, you know, I think one continuity among them, and that being Fiddler. Um, so yeah, it was rough because we had many NPCs that never made it out of the tunnels, and they'd been, you know, major players in the gaming that we did. Um, but yeah, I guess a part of me just wanted to retire them and put them to sleep, um, but then re-explore the notion of how an army like that can be formed, and so that's where the Bone Hunters came from.
Okay, now, complicated question. One of the most confusing things about Gardens of the Moon is about the politics of the Empire.
About the
Lassim
what?
seems,
Sorry,
I'm
the
saying
what?
the politics of the Empire.
Politics.
Lassim seems determined to wipe out every person that has ever been loyal to the Emperor. And in doing that, she comes off as a weak, threatened leader.
Mm.
She sends Lorne, and she says that they already killed everybody they could have, just the High Fist and the bridge burners are left, and of course the High Fist's army. She is afraid of the fact that the Dajek, that's how you pronounce it,
Dujek? Dujek? Yeah.
Dujek, okay, that his army is mostly made of Seven Cities soldiers, and Seven Cities about to rise up. So she wants to wipe out the army. She wants to wipe out the mages that are still loyal to the emperor, and she wants to be done with the bridge burners.
Mm-hmm.
Then on the other hand, in Memories of Ice, we get to find out that actually she didn't mean to do any of that. It was just a stage for the outlawing. I think that the more I'm reading this, she really didn't mean to wipe them all out. And as Seven Cities rose up and she got information about the Penny and Domin, she changed her mind and turned her mistake into an advantage by outlawing them. Is that the way it went?
Yeah, that's pretty close. She changes her mind. I mean, the assumption, you know, that she was planning all this right from the start, is itself attributing far too much um, control to Lacine. But I mean, it's a common thing to occur. quite often, if you look at conspiracy theories, um, they are attributing far too much efficacy to, and far too much capability to the players in that conspiracy. Um, the problem that Lacine had was she knew, or was fairly certain, that she failed in killing um, Kellenved and Dancer. Not only that, a lot of the main individuals who were part of that creation of the empire, people like Urko and Krust and others, um, were anticipating being wiped out by Lacine and fake their own deaths. So she knows, the army may be sitting out there, bridge burners saying, well, she got rid of Urko, she got rid of um, Talk Elder, she got rid of Carther and Krust, et cetera, et cetera, when in fact she didn't. In fact, they preempted by staging their own deaths and dropping out. So she doesn't know where they are. She knows she didn't kill them, which then, fosters a lot of fear and paranoia. What are they up to? And so, those initial impulses on her part to, well, let's wipe the slate clean, because I don't know, I don't know who's involved in, if there is any kind of conspiracy. Um, and then, of course, the whole, series opens with Lacine getting a sense that something happened in Itko Can that, probably involved the Hounds of Shadow, which just feeds into her fears. And so I have great sympathy for her as a character. And I know Cam did, Cam definitely did. He took her in a very different direction than you would expect. Um, so, yeah, she certainly had to be a little bit more um, flexible in her planning um, than she was in the habit of being. And certainly in the Memories of Ice storyline indicates that she had to sort of change tacts, change direction fairly quickly. But also Taishran did a lot of things by assuming things that, assuming that Lacine wanted this, that, or the other being done. He took too many things into his own hands.
Okay. During the Siege of Vale, when Taishran starts releasing demons against the mages and also against the army, why did Anomander choose to destroy the demons rather than attack his enemy?
Why did he choose to destroy demons?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're nothing but trouble when they show up. They're indiscriminate, so because they're mad at everyone with good reason. So yeah, I mean, there would be, I guess, if you will, acts of mercy, even as he was being fairly indiscriminate in his magic. I don't know if he explains it at some point, but he basically, he threw that magic out there in the hopes that the sheer body count would be enough to make them pull back, but they didn't, because Taishran didn't care. So
Okay. You often say that you write as if you were writing a movie script, not a book. And
yeah, I write visually. Yes.
from all the books, I think Gardens of the Moon is the one that sticks mostly to this style of writing, for which it's criticized often for jumping around, for apparently there being no connection between scenes. I always saw it, but people are different. Um, do you think? I mean, when we watch a movie, we trust that the next scene will be somehow related. But when it comes to the book, people don't always extend the same courtesy. So, do you believe that the relationship of trust between author and reader is something is the reason why this happens?
Sure. And that's the one aspect where, in many respects, Gardens of the Moon failed in for many readers in sort of conveying that element of trust me, I know where I'm going on this. And I guess it was, I talked about various elements and stuff that I threw in, and then things that I pared back and didn't provide the full, all the flags necessary in order to understand a particular scene. Um, I was very cagey in the writing of that novel, and in many respects too cagey. But at the same time, I thought, well, for me, it's not as much trust as um, conveying, I guess, a sense of authority that I knew what I was talking about, um, scene by scene. And that's what I worked the most on because um, maybe because my audience of one being Cam, the issue of trust never came up. Um, the trust was absolute between us. So that may have been one of the flaws of the first book was that I simply assumed that the reader uh, would have enough faith that I knew what I was up to, um, and I assumed that they would get that based off of the sentence by sentence structure and the scene by scene structure, um, and the element of control that I had on that narrative. And I mean, in many respects, that backfired um, because the control was almost too much, and I got very, very cagey in the writing of it. Things loosened up later, but it was certainly I think one of the things that probably made that book hard to find a publisher to begin with. And of course, publishers are looking for that element of trust as well. They want to know that this is going somewhere as a narrative. And it was only the first book. Um, I was holding back on writing. I think if I had had Gardens of the Moon, Dead House Gates, and Memories of Ice, and was pitched all three at once, then we wouldn't have had that 8-year gap, and we wouldn't have had such a battle on getting the publishers on board. But I mean, how do I know?
Do you believe that this relationship of trust between author and reader, is it something that is determined by the personality of the reader in the sense that there are people who will give it to every author they read and people who will not? Or is it more a case by case situation, as in to this one I will trust and this one I won't? And
I think
can
it's a bit of both. I think one opens up a book in the hope and the faith that the author knows what they're up to, and you can then trust in that. Um, but the more you read, the more you discover that that's not always the case. There are books I read that um, I lose trust in the narrator, um, and so and it's because of the choices the narrator makes, um, where I sense that they've not. It's instinctive that they're not actually thinking through the potential implications of what they just said or what they just wrote. Um, and that's where my trust then drops away. And so I think for readers, and I'm a reader as much as I am a writer. So um, things like your belief systems can have a huge impact on whether or not you trust an author. Um, I mean, I stumbled onto a number of science fiction books by a particular author who, as it turned out, was extremely right wing. And I was discovering that I was losing trust and faith in that author's verisimilitude in terms of um, describing an accurate reality of this world. It was so twisted to one side that I eventually I couldn't keep reading. So I think it is down to um, it's down to our belief systems, our private belief systems, and whether those things are um, either being affirmed or challenged. And I mean, I don't mind them being challenged if they're challenged well, but if they're challenged on the basis of an assumption that the audience believes everything the author believes, then we're in trouble.
Okay. Now, another controversial one. Your characterization is often criticized, and it beats me. I don't know why. But maybe, not everything works the same for the
Mm-hmm.
same people. So I was thinking, sometimes even in our own fan group, in our own fandom, your characterization seems misunderstood at times. I'm going to point at Felicine and the hatred she gets quite often. And I believe that has to do not so much with your characterization, but it has to do with the way people interpret what they see as behavior. You use this combination of show don't tell
Mm-hmm.
as a style of characterization, and then you know some people may see the trauma that she's experiencing, others project themselves in the shoes of Heboric and Boden, and
Mm-hmm.
we all helped people who then were ungrateful or hurt us in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And do you believe that one of the reasons why your characterization style doesn't work for some readers is their own inability to translate the behavior they witnessed into the emotion that you're trying to convey?
Um, no, I don't think so. I think a lot of, especially the fantasy genre, quite often characters are performing roles. They have a function to the story. Um, so that they stand in as, they can be the audience's point of view. Um, they can be the audience's wish fulfillment. Um, and fantasy, similar to comic, superheroes, in film and in comics, um, they are that stand-in that is apparently capable of reducing the complexities of modern life to right, wrong, good, evil. Um, and so you then follow that person. You follow, Frodo. You follow um, whatever hero is standing up front, in front of and against fairly simplified forces of evil or darkness. Um, and so that trains us to an expectation when we crack open the book of a fantasy novel. This has changed, of course, over time, but traditionally, anyways. Um, and so we want that sort of element of infallibility, but also that very satisfying aspect of having the prowess or the capability of delivering a very straightforward eye for an eye style justice upon the bad guys. Um, and I think there's a great visceral need in each and every one of us to sometimes see that played out, and we see that through um, all films that relate to some kind of action hero of some form or another. Um, and so that expectation can be brought into um, a fantasy series in a pretty matter of fact fashion, as an assumption. And that was one of the things that I wanted to sort of dismantle. Um, so you would end up with characters who were deeply flawed, and ones who were, just as we are struggling to make sense of what constitutes good and evil in our world, they are experiencing the same struggle, because it's just as complicated and nuanced and um, ambivalent in the Malazan world as it is in ours. And that may run against the expectations of some readers. They want things more simple. or rather simpler, to make use of good grammar as opposed to bad grammar. And so people like characters like Felicin, well, she's initially set out as very much an innocent victim. Um, and yes, there might be a desire that the innocence is somehow held on to, regardless of what she experiences. Um, and by virtue of that innocence, then she is worth saving. But what happens when the innocence is lost, and it can actually raise the question in the reader, is she worth saving? That's the question I wanted to explore. My answer, of course, is of course she's worth saving. But I wrote her with deep empathy, but also I wrote it very much in a very disciplined style of recognizing that her only defense was to lash out, and that is what kept would repeatedly force people away. And even those people who are being forced away, they can recognize it, but it doesn't change the fact that they're flawed as well, and they're not dealing with it in a very positive fashion. So it's a complex situation with Felicin and Bowden and Herborg. And I, exploring it to the extent I did so early in the series was a very risky thing to do. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was very risky because she's, there's a lot of Felicin, and for a lot of readers, she's not a character they wanted to hang out with. So.
I had an exchange once with a girl on some fantasy forum, and she was actually complaining about this. She was saying that I need the author to tell me what the character is feeling. I don't want to witness it and have to guess it. So I was thinking that that might work in the case of Felicin, and generally this style of show don't tell rather than explicitly telling people what is happening.
Yeah, yeah. And I get that. I mean, and that's a legitimate, complaint. If somebody wants simply to be told, then yeah, they better not be reading, my stuff, because I'm not going to tell you. And whatever you want to take from, these scenes and this story, um, is going to be based on the amount you want to invest in it, and the amount of work you want to do. And a lot of reading doesn't involve that kind of stuff, and that's fine. It's just it's a different approach. I mean, there are plenty of books I read that I just I have no sort of deep engagement in the characters. I can see the roles they're playing. I see the function they have for the narrative, um, and I'm fine with that. And I just run with it. So it's in that sense, I guess the Malazan series does self-limit its audience, because it is asking a little bit more than what they might be expecting when they open the book.
Okay, this next one should be easy. During the prologue, we meet Lacine, and she is described as having dusky blue skin. This question has been asked over and over and over again. What kind of color do the Napan people have? How dark? I mean, if you Google dusky blue, you'll get a wide variety of shades.
All right. If you want a real world comparison, there are paintings on the walls of temples in India that have blue skinned individuals. You will also find similar blue in some Egyptian panels. So that's basically it. That's sort of the color we had in mind.
A lot of people are going to be happy about this. Okay, so when Perrin passes through the gate and he ends up in the throne room on top of his mare, He finds Lassim seated on a throne of twisted bone. Was that meant to remind of the first throne of the Tlanimas, her throne?
Yeah, it's a facsimile thereof. Yes.
Okay. Now, another one, this one might be a little detailed. After Sari does her thing at the constabulary where she gets hired, Paran comes behind chasing for her in the aftermath. And so he tells Lorne that there's no way they can find out what happened, even if they call a necromancer, because there were a lot of pigeons inside and they were the heralds of death. So what I understood from this is that the dead did not see what and who killed them, so calling a necromancer would be useless. Are
Mm-hmm.
we to understand that Sorry, the rope, first summoned murderous pigeons and then went and killed everybody?
No, the pigeons aren't. They're not the instruments of murder. They're more of a. It's one of those scenes that I probably um, I cannot think back to the actual motivation for throwing them in there. Um, I know one of my favorite stories was Robert E. Howard's Pigeons from Hell, and I remember I was listening to a Pretenders song where that phrase is actually used uh, by Chrissy Hind in one of her songs, and I remember thinking, has she read Pigeons from Hell? Because it's such a obscure short story, but she may well have, for all I know. And probably when I was building the scene, I had the headphones on. I could well have been listening to the Pretenders, and pigeons came up, and I just thought, oh, what the hell, and just threw them in there. I cannot tell you the motivations for, and in many respects, those pigeons don't fit with the rest of the Malazan world and universe's mythos at all. They're never revisited, so it's probably just one of those outliers that will confuse people for no good reason, unfortunately.
Okay. After his meeting with Lassim, he goes to talk to Lorne. He's brought there by Topper, and then on his way out, he hears a cough behind a curtain, which of course was a sign to him that, you're being monitored. Aside from the fact that it was a veiled threat to Paran, does Lassim monitor her agent so obsessively? Is she so distrustful of everybody?
I don't know. Those kind of the you throw those things out there not with specific answers or specific details in mind, but to convey particular impressions, so that it's an atmosphere of um, surveillance and paranoia. That's what I wanted to convey. And so the specifics, not really relevant, probably didn't even occur to me what was going on there, but simply the fact that it was going on.
So even Lorne, even her own adjunct, she was paranoid about.
It's well possible, yeah. By
Okay.
that point, yeah.
We also get to meet Felicin and Tavor in Gardens of the Moon briefly when
Mm-hmm.
Paran goes home, and it caught my eye that Tavor is also always, even here, she's presenting standing behind a chair with the hands on the back. That's a really cool detail. And she refers to Felicin as being too soft for this world, probably for any other.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me wondering, is her name, Felicin, somehow reminding of the Latin name for happiness, of Felix, Felicitas, some sort of irony for her fate?
Um, Probably not consciously. People often ask me about my naming conventions, and I really don't have a good answer for them. I'll get into a mindset early on when I'm, creating uh, my notes for a novel, and that mindset will be, well, today's the day I start naming characters, and I just they just come, they just arrive, and some of them I like and I stay with. Some of them I go so, and they end up usually, dying somewhere in the book if I use that name. Um, But other ones, I just, for whatever reason, yeah, I like that name. And yeah, so it's not a satisfying answer by any means. They just, names pop into my head, and that still happens because I creating the characters for the God is not willing, and the other two trilogies, or the other two books in the trilogy. Again, the names just arrived, and they seem to arrive carrying with them uh, a lot of the personality of that character, um, and that's it's almost like a complete package that's just arrived to me. So I have a character called Stillwater, and she's one of my favorite characters of the new book. Um, and yeah, the name just arrived, and it arrived as one of the squad members. And I was looking for points of view, and so I looked at my list and picked one, and it was Stillwater. And so, um, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I followed specific linguistic groups for naming, but in many instances, a lot of the naming conventions were inspired by uh, Vietnam War writers like Gustav Hasford and Glenn Cook, um, because we did that in the gaming as well. So for listen, no, it just sounded nice, I think.
Okay, that's good enough. After the Battle of Pale, Terrasail notices that so much magic has been unleashed that you could that it almost tore a fabric bit, between the worlds, tore the fabric
Mm,
between the worlds, and that you could almost reach out with your hand and touch the one of chaos.
mm.
Now, if all magic battles achieve something similar, provided they are powerful enough, would that be how Silcha's ruin managed to basically destroy Shadow? Magic
Um,
so intense released that it tore a wound, not just thinned the fabric.
some of that I cannot give you direct answer for because it's relevant to Walk in Shadow, the third Carcanis book. So I'll have to avoid being specific on that one. But at the same time as that sort of the veils between the planes of the Warrens um, being weakened, they do recover, they do heal. So
This one is also a little specific. The use of the Empire and their command over the armies of the Tlanimas. Lorne finds out from Tool that there were actually 28 Jacquard wars instead of 27, and she was complaining that, when you went into 7 cities, you should have informed the Empress because otherwise, this way she lost a powerful army. He says, we didn't know we were going to return. And that implies somehow that she did have some sort of control over them. We know of the Battle of Arran, where the Tlanimas have been released, but then he also speaks about the Battle of Khartoum, where Olarethil, she was the only bonecaster to have ever stood and in the ranks and fought for the Malazan Empire. So that suggests there have been other battles where the Mas helped the empire. So how much control do they actually have over them? I mean, it's possible that Lassine wouldn't want Lorne to know that she has very little or no control over them.
yeah, she wouldn't want Lauren to know. She wouldn't want anyone to know because, and this is a massive spoiler, so bear that in mind. But um, command of the Talana Mass was predicated upon seating yourself on the throne, uh, that particular throne. And the fact that Lysine, when she sat herself down on that, nothing happened, told her that Kellenved wasn't dead. And so that's why she never really had control over the Talana Mass. It wasn't that they weren't going to take her orders, it was that they were still under the control of of Shadow Throne, of Kellanved. And so, you know, if Kellanved found it expedient to let the Imass do what they needed to do, or did for him anyways on card tool, then that's up to him. It's got nothing to do with her. And of course, imagine sort of, you know, taking control of an empire, and your most formidable um, military force is not even under your control. That's a pretty shaky throne to be sitting on. And so she's always been in that scenario. She's always been faced with the fact that she could not actually control the most powerful element of the empire's military.
But that still brings another question, because in Path to Ascendancy, we know that he really couldn't order them. He tricked them and found a way around to make them do what he needed to do, but without giving the order. So it makes you wonder, how did he achieve to continue to do that while he had command over them?
Yeah, and it also it raises the question of, you know, just how much command ever existed. And I mean, when we gamed that stuff, that's how we played it. Um, you know, Cam was playing Kellanved, and so the campaign and the introduction to the Talana Mass was all sort of from my gaming, or rather my campaign. Um, and I never revealed to the extent to which his character Kellanved had control over the Talana Mass, and that was part of the fun, was that he never knew, and I was never going to tell him. So sometimes things worked and sometimes they didn't, and sometimes he gave orders and they were followed, and sometimes they were completely ignored. And it was amusing. It was a very fun aspect of the game, because um, yeah, he would come into scenarios with, you know, brimming with confidence because he's got that Lalana Mass, and then he'd call on them and they wouldn't show up. You know, so it was fun.
Tethersail thinks that even the Talani Mass would not be able to penetrate, or would not be willing to penetrate, Moonspawn defenses. And that got me curious. In order to destroy Atlantic Mass, I mean, you can destroy it, you can turn it to powder, but it still won't die. Can Drake use Dragon Pool to bring Atlantic Mass inside? It seems unfeasible.
Yeah, and as far as I know, when they get into Dragnipur, there's no Talana Mass there, is there? I don't think I either Cam or I ever mention any Talana Mass pulling that wagon.
No, there
Um,
wasn't.
so Tattersail's mistaken. I mean, she doesn't know. That's the problem. Um, and that's one of the things that's, you know, pretty central to these books, is that opinions are all tied to points of view, and those points of view can be ill-informed, uninformed. Um, they can be biased. They can be, you know, the last thing they can be is dependable. And so you just have to take it at face value that she believed that at the time. Whether it's true or not, it's not really relevant.
Okay. The next one is actually about your postmodernist tendencies in writing. I didn't know much about postmodernism until recently, but there are two main things I'd like to approach. One is the fact that you want to subvert meta narratives. The other one is about allowing people to reach their own conclusions and take their own meaning from what you say. And from what I've read, postmodernism is big on the idea that the meaning of the speaker is irrelevant. It's the meaning that the listener takes from that that matters. So, as a scientist and as an author, have you ever experienced some sort of internal conflict between this disregard toward empirical evidence on one side, or in other words, how much do you ascribe to? How much do you resonate with the
Oh,
postmodern?
I mean, what you're asking is a very is very much a subject that I have given a lot of thought to. Um, and I've come to the conclusion that I'm perfectly content with contradiction. Um, and in that respect, I don't put as much weight on empirical evidence as you might expect. So much of it is tied and anchored to a particular perspective, and all of our perspectives are limited and flawed in some fashion or another. So when you talk about me um, subverting the meta narrative, uh, I wouldn't be I wouldn't have bothered if I didn't think the meta narrative had something of great value in it. And so, because if my thinking was exclusively postmodern, then you don't bother subverting the meta narrative. You ignore the meta narrative because it has no relevance to your belief systems. But for me, it has great relevance. And I think it's a very potent aspect of what the human condition is. So that contradiction is always going to sit there. And it's going to be, I mean, it's played out in the series. Yes, there's elements that are post-structural, and there's elements that are postmodernist. But they are not at the same time throwing out the meta narrative, because how can they? It is a meta narrative. The entire series is a meta narrative. And that was kind of what I was messing around with. I recognized early on that by virtue of the act of storytelling, I'm creating a meta narrative. There's no way around it, because it's being built, brick by brick, and that's with deliberation and intent. So the meta narrative is implicit to the Malazan novels and series. So, try to get on, a pedestal and then turn around and say, well, this is in keeping with a postmodern postmodernist belief system on my part is nonsense. I mean, yes, there are postmodern takes you can make on the series and post-structural as well, but not in a absolute sense. And one cannot assume that because it's a postmodernist fantasy that I am a postmodernist, because I'm not. So, and that's that's just the way it is, and that's why there are built into uh, this series a meta narrative and a meta narrative point of view that when I describe Toll the Hounds as the cipher to the series is right there in everybody's face in the voice I use in Toll the Hounds. So
Okay, that answers it. We get to experience the Warrens for the first time, and Tattersail refers to Coral Galen as elder magic, the breath of chaos. And later on, when searching for Hairlock, Quick Ben ends up in a place deep within the Warren of Chaos that he calls the Spar of Andy, which is described as an actual geological formation that begins at the border with Chaos and bifurcates. So at the same time, Tool refers to Starvel Demelaine as the first Warren.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that Starvel Demelaine is chaotic, and then there's chaos, and then there's darkness. How related are the three?
Closely, and a lot of that will get spelled out in Walk in Shadow, the third book, because the Carcanis trilogy has that as the backdrop. Curled Galen, Startled Demelaine is broached over the Sea of Vitter, and the dragons arrive. And chaos, of course, is behind it all. So that stuff I can't be more specific than that because, I'm still writing the third book. I'm writing Walk in Shadow. So.
Because this also seems to play on the philosophical and actually real, their own reality in the books, that darkness was the first force to stand in opposition to chaos. And
Sure.
they seem somehow, they're the same and not the same, standing in opposition to each other, order and chaos, different faces of the same coin.
Sure. It's creation versus absence, darkness being absence. So yeah, I mean, you can't define one without the other.
Um, there's something about the behavior of the Malazan soldiery. On one side, we have the bridge burners who would rather kill a captain that isn't good for the job. On the other side, we have what happened at Erin after the chain of dogs, and they all surrendered their weapons. And it seems somewhat contradictory. And I'm playing this specifically in the scenario of the Siege of Pale, where we have these three hills with sorcerers on top of them. There's going to be devastating magic. And yet the army has been placed right in between those hills as if somebody was waiting for them to be crushed.
Yeah.
Why didn't they say no?
First of all, that notion of offing your officers if they were rubbish, I kept pretty exclusive to the bridge burners. It's carried over a little bit into the bone hunters, but not too much. But I think I've talked to enough veterans and read enough to know that one of the most difficult but essential adaptations a soldier has to make is accepting the contradictions of their position. And so those kind of things will happen, where you follow your orders, basically all the way into the grave. And in other instances, you go, wait a minute, no, not this time, or not in these circumstances. An army, a military is like any other organism. It's not consistent, and it's not internally consistent. And authors have explored this in great detail. I think Catch-22. It's about the absurdity within the military. So none of that sort of struck me as unlikely. I could see people being or objecting to it because they're annoyed that the army ended up doing a stupid thing at the end of Deadhouse Gates. Well, that sometimes happens. It's they're not always sort of going to make the right decisions.
Okay. Now about the nature of the Andy. I mean, okay, they lost their goddess, they lost their home, and in combination with their longevity, that seems to be the source of the dark, melancholic nature. So much so to the point that Teresale, when she reads the deck, she claims that Anomander is seated on the throne of sorrow. And we know from the Carcanis trilogy that the Thais, all of the Thais, have the blood of chaos, which might be responsible in part for their nature. But Diadur lost their home world too, and they lost their god as well. So why are the Andi so predisposed to it, while Diadur are not?
I think in many respects, it comes back to the notion of to what extent does the entity you are worshiping, or rather, to what extent do you absorb the entity you're worshiping in terms of its attitudes, its views, its own, I guess, approach. So Mother Dark is a very different entity from Father Light, if you will, and the personalities that are involved there. So it's just, I mean, cultures will take and make different choices. and that just, you extend that over time, and the division becomes all the greater. Um, and the Taistadeur, well, their origin history is a very, very different one, and it's the one that is being played out in the Carcanis trilogy, um, and that will shape much of their uniqueness with respect to the Andi and the Leosin. Um, they are very much a special case. So, and we didn't get to see much of the Thais Leosin anyway, so um, it can lead readers to sort of a misapprehension regarding the relationships of the three and how they are as cultures. Um, but it's basically what I am exploring in the Carcanis trilogy, and so that's sort of the place of origin for all three, and why they ended up the way they ended up.
Okay. When Whiskey Jack meets Tattersail in the aftermath of the Pale Battle, she displays survivor's guilt, and it's a guilt that we partake in looking at the empty armor covering the hill. And speaking of bad characterization, that's a really good way of sharing what she's feeling without actually spelling it out.
Mm,
This seems to be one of the main running themes of the series, the survivor's guilt.
sure.
Do you think that it's unique just to soldiers and people who go through dramatic events, or is it something that we all experience at some point or another, mainly, let's say, when mourning, when we lose someone dear?
Sure. I think I think we all experience it. Um, it's certainly one thing I would not make a point of avoiding uh, in a fantasy story, and it bothers me sometimes that we don't see enough of it in uh, superhero films, and even fantasy stuff like Conan or whatever. Um, there's no remorse, and there's no complexity to um, the aftermath of traumatic events. It's just, especially a lot of the grimdark stuff now, it's just thrown away. It's like, yeah, I killed 20,000 people yesterday and I'm fine today. And, it's like, where is the repercussions of these things? Was it Duke of Wellington that always talked about the melancholy of victory post battle? And, when you read that and you think, well, let me try to think my way and feel my way through that, um, to see what he's talking about when he talks about you know that there is a sense of great sadness even following a victorious battle. um, that always stayed with me, and so I wanted to sort of, to use modern coinage, unpack that complex um, series of sentiments that follow on from victory. And that's, I mean, partly it's why, these three guys talking about Gardens of the Moon, when they talked about the chapter with the Siege of Pale, they broke it down into chronological order rather than the flashback. And one of the commentators basically said he couldn't see the reason for the flashback. But I wanted to start the entire series with the aftermath of a battle, not the battle. Um, because that's, I mean, I knew that there were going to be massive campaigns, battles, last stands, all kinds of things throughout the series. Um, but those battles are not the story. They're things that happen. And the story is, how do you deal with those things that happen as characters? So that's why the novel, or that's why that chapter opens with after the siege of Pale, after the battle, um, that's kind of the message I guess I'm subconsciously trying to deliver. Um, that I'm more interested in the stuff that follows, not in the battles. And I have found that the more I write, the less I'm interested in writing battle sequences or fight sequences. I just I feel like I've I've approached that and done that. And there's not much more to be said about it. It can feel exciting to read as a fan, but it's not quite, and it never has been um, essential to my storytelling. Uh, it's been necessary, but it hasn't been essential. And I'm more interested in how people deal with the consequences of surviving something that many others did not survive. And in many respects, haven't we all done that? Haven't our entire line of ancestors done the same thing, or we wouldn't be here today? Um, vast percentages of humanity has dropped to the wayside, and their legacy is gone. Um, and I guess when I think of it in those terms, especially as an archaeologist, yeah, there's survivor's guilt, and there's a sense that there's no particular reason, um, as much as they have tried to create reasons for why, you know, this species survived, this species of hominid survived, and that one didn't. I'm pretty much reached a point now where my belief is it's all down to chance. Um, it's all down to chance that we're here and Neanderthals aren't. It was a bad luck. Climate change is probably the only reason why we are here and they aren't. Um, so maybe as a species, in an epigenetic fashion, we all carry that survivor's guilt. Maybe that's what drives paleoanthropologists to go and hunt out our earliest progenitors, the various subspecies that led to us, and then the various other ones that fell to the wayside. I'm always when I read that stuff and I think of Homo naledi or whatever, the South African ones that I know led quote nowhere. Um, I feel that melancholy, that same melancholy, that sadness, um, and the wish to that it would have been nice had they survived. It would have been nice had Homo floresiensis survived. And for all we know, maybe there's a couple of them hanging around somewhere in Indonesia. Um, and so yeah, maybe there is an epigenetic element to that we have all absorbed a certain element of survivor's guilt. I hadn't thought about it before, but thinking about it now, that seems quite possible.
Okay, next one. Tabor feels like the honor of the family has been stained by Paran's choice to become a renegade. However, it wasn't Dujak who decided to defect, it was the empress who declared them outlaws. So why would that shame affect Paran and his family? Since he had no say in it,
No,
he
he had
was
no
declared
say.
outlawed.
Yeah, and Tabor is projecting. She's projecting her own guilt and if you will, future betrayal. Um, characters are flawed, and their belief systems are no different than our own in the sense that we will take something in our past and with an internal narrative, we will retell that story in our heads until we've got it down pat, and then it becomes real. It becomes something that actually happened rather than something we've just invented. That's in our nature, to retell those stories of our past as if they were real, um, when all they are interpretations, and usually interpretations after the fact that are self-serving in some fashion or another. So yeah, that's just Tavor.
Okay. At the end of his conversation with Paran, uh, with Topper, Paran wonders if there's this distinction between the empire and the empress. And that seems like an important concept with ramifications in our own world as well. Are a country and its ruler one and the same? And
Mhm.
how about if you look at it from the point of view of democracy, let's take America and Trump, and on the other side, a totalitarian country like maybe Iraq under Saddam Hussein. How does that work?
I don't know. I don't know if I have any particular answer to that. I think a country's leaders are often a reflection um, of some aspect of uh, a collective sensibility within that nation. Um, but I also think there's so much going on, at least here in the West, um, that is subverting the uh, element of participation of the common citizen um, with respect to governments and power. And I think it's been a conscious and deliberate um, disenfranchising of um, your citizen, your average citizen, um, with respect to the decisions being made on behalf of that country. So I think that's, and I think a lot of people feel that, and they may not feel it or be able to um, actually pin it down, but they are experiencing that sense of frustration, that feeling of powerlessness, um, and then how that's then manifested um, in terms of belief systems is uh, pretty much almost random. It can be to the far right, it can be to the far left, it can be, you name it. It seems to manifest in almost every way imaginable. But I do think there is um, an almost universal, in terms of humanity, feeling of a loss of control, and how one responds to that varies depending on personalities, and cultural traits, or whatever. Um, so we are going to see, I think, increasingly extremes. Just as the climate is achieving its extremes, we are going to be experiencing our own. Yeah, it's grim.
Okay, I'm going to try one more question before we end this. Not bad, 36 out of 147. Still have some to go.
All right.
So there's a quote that caught my attention, a small exchange between Paran and Topper, where he says that, let me see, that the empress expects obedience from her servants and demands loyalty. To which Paran's answered that any reasonable ruler would have the expectation and demand the other way around.
The other way around, yeah.
There's very little difference technically between expectation and demand. And true, loyalty cannot be demanded, but then obedience not really either. So
No, he's young, but and in that instance, he's more interested in
annoying Topper.
yeah, firing back than he is in anything else. Yeah, he's being contrary for other reasons, and that's the other thing, of course, is people say things for the motivations for saying things are not always straightforward and direct, and quite often those motivations have got nothing to do with the actual subject at hand. There's other things at play. So
Okay. So before we are done, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity and for the ones to come as well. Just
yeah,
tell me more.
I guess we're looking at about three parts to this, aren't we? We're like
Apparently. And then there are the other books too. So there will be many. Although I think that Gardens of the Moon is the thickest in terms of information and layers and questions. At least I hope so.
Yeah. It seems that most of the questions you've asked today have been out of Gardens of the Moon.
All of the questions are from
All of
Gardens
them.
of the Moon, but we've hardly reached page 96. There's still a lot to go.
Wow.
Well, I suppose they weren't that terribly detailed.
Oh no, but I mean, I tend to give long answers, so now you know. I don't give you short answers.
But that's good. Okay. And I would also like to,
When's the next part? When are we going to do the next part?
whenever you're willing and have
Right.
time.
Cool.
Okay, then see you next time.
Yes. See you next time. Take
Thank
care.
you. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.